Hey folks, Michael Mann from Michael Mann Security Services. Welcome to Appropriate Force, a Citizen's Guide to Self-Protection. Before we get fully started and jump into the webinar, let's go over some admin stuff real quick of what's coming up. First, to get a hold of us, first time, you can get us on michaelmannsecurityservices.com. That is our website. You'll see at the top resources, which we have white pages, videos, and then training and events. You can see what we've got coming up. You can get us, contact us by phone, 615-606-1006. That's Scott's phone number. If he doesn't answer, leave him a message. He will get right back to you. Or you can email us at scottm, S-C-O-T-T-M, at michaelmannsecurityservices.com. Or you can always send us an email at safewithman through Facebook. I usually see that right away, and I'll respond back immediately unless I'm tied up on something else, and Scott does the same thing. All right? So a couple things as we wait on folks to join us, what we've got coming up. This Sunday, July 12th, 2020, we have a virtual instructor-led training session. So that's an online format. You can do this from the comfort of your home. That's from 1 p.m. to 5 p.m., and that is security operations. So 1 p.m. to 5 p.m. Central Standard Time this Sunday. It is module 1 of 3 modules for the Church Protection Special Certification. Again, it's about 4 hours, $75 per module. There's a lot of good information in there, and we're going to talk about this today very specifically about some things you saw last week and how to mitigate and deal with that. All right. So security operations, if you got questions, email us at on Facebook at Safe with Man, or get Scott at Scott, S-C-O-T-T-M, at michaelmannsecurityservices.com, and we'll answer the questions for you. Okay. Terrorism prevention for security. So this is going to be like this, a Facebook Live event, but we're also going to be doing this event in person. I'll send the email out if you register for this, or if you attend a plan here in Nashville. We were going to have that here in Brentwood, Tennessee, and that's had to move. We've had to move it because of COVID concerns. So what we're going to do is we're going to have that at Lighthouse Christian School. So we're moving it from Brentwood to Antioch. We had a seminar there last night, and so I'll send that email out if you're going to be actually coming in person to watch the seminar. But again, we're going to do that via Facebook Live from 5:30 p.m. to 7:30 p.m. Next Tuesday. This is, so instead of having a webinar next Wednesday, you're going to be able to watch the webinar here. So if you haven't registered for that or you have not gotten an email on it, Scott's going to send you that email within the next couple days. So again, this will take place of our webinar next week. 2 hours of a lot of information that you can use, whether you're on a church volunteer security team, you're a private citizen, you're a security professional. You're not going to want to miss this. A lot of good information. If you come to Antioch at Lighthouse Christian in person, refreshments are going to be there for you, and you're also going to get a chance to win prizes. All right. Our most popular event, Introduction to Defensive Handgun, that's July 24th, 25th, Brentwood, Tennessee. You can find that on our webpage. One thing I don't have on here, which we have come up in August. Scott, do you remember the date on the active shooter? August the 15th. I know it, never mind. So August the 15th this year, so that's next month, we're going to have an active shooter response 4-hour in-person training class at Fellowship Bible Church in Brentwood, Tennessee. It's going to include force-on-force exercises. That's going to include, so for $50, that includes your lunch, all snacks. That's going to include the use of all equipment, all inert weapons, and force-on-force weapons. And every participant will get a certificate of completion, and you are going to get an advanced law enforcement active shooter response manual. It is a law enforcement manual, but you can use some of the tactics and some of the information in there to assist with designing your own training security program. So it's a pretty good sized book. It's really thick. I think it's a couple hundred pages. So you get all that for $50. That's August the 15th. Go to our webpage. You will see it. Basically we're paying you to come to that course for $50. So if you're here in Middle Tennessee, come to it, especially if you're in a volunteer church security team. A lot of good information that you can use in your training programs. Hopefully you never have to use the information to respond to something. All right, expectations. All right, so appropriate force, the Citizen's Guide to Self-Protection. So we're going to get into basically considerations to start off with, what this means, what it looks like. We're going to talk about the use of force. We're going to talk about guidelines for private citizens. That includes, if you're out by yourself, you've got a carry permit, or you're carrying a baton or pepper spray, you're out with your family trying to protect them, you're a volunteer on a church security team, or you're a private security professional. What does that mean as far as use of force? We're going to talk about the use of force continuum, which most of the time is a law enforcement term or function, but it also applies to us as private citizens, and I'm going to go through that in detail to explain how you use that to protect yourself and the people or the assets you're trying to protect. And we're going to talk about something that's very popular right now that everybody's talking about. When can you display a firearm if you think a threat is present? So I'm going to go over those guidelines with you and tell you some things that are probably going to be shocking to you, show you some videos and some cases that have happened over the last 2 weeks that have caused an uproar, and then I'll kind of give you not what I necessarily think about the videos, but what we see, and then some things you can do to avoid problems with that. All right, so let's get started. Appropriate force. Let's talk about consideration. So as a private citizen, you've heard me say this before in other webinars. If this is your first time when I keep talking about these other webinars, we've got 14 or 15 webinars that we've done over the last several months that are on our website. Again, go to michaelmannsecurityservices.com. Go to resources under videos. You'll see those. They're listed there. So if this is the first time here and you want to catch up and you've got a bunch of time this weekend, go back. They're free. A lot of good resources on that page. So let's talk about the use of force for us as a private citizen. We use the basic protection model here like we do with everything, and that first element is avoidance. We want to avoid if we can at all possible, just even the idea of confrontation, the use of force. So we will avoid this if we possibly can. All right. So, of course, in that beginning is awareness. We understand the situation. Then we try to avoid it so we get away from it. And then, of course, defense is always last. So, number one, what I want you to remember about the use of force for us private citizens, the rules of the use of force for citizens vary in every state. So the rules in the state of Tennessee, which I'll talk about, but we're going to try to generalize them as best we can to help you work through this process on your own. Every state has its own set of rules on self-defense. So my suggestion is I'm going to talk about Tennessee and some general rules, but if you're trying to figure out how you do this, and obviously that's why you're here today, I'm assuming, you want to go into your state statutes and you need to read those on your own. Okay? And so work through that process and understand what you have to do in the state you're in. Number two, you're acting on your own authority. So as a private citizen, if I use force, I'm acting on my own authority. Okay? Unlike a police officer who's acting on the authority of a government that he is working for, where they have immunities and privileges, we don't have those because we're acting under our own authority when we use force against someone else. Another example would be like a private security guard. Private security guards, there's some exceptions, but for the most part, a private security guard is acting as a private citizen. The only difference is if they're working and being paid by someone or an organization, they're working under the authority of that organization or the property they're protecting. But as a private citizen out walking around every day, you are acting under your own authority. Now, church security teams, some of you guys may have questions about that. Whose authority you're acting under? Like any volunteer, obviously, if there's a use of force situation involved at your church, you are, if you're a volunteer, the church allows you to volunteer. You've gone through some kind of process to identify you as a volunteer. You're acting under the authority of the church, or you could be, so you need to be very, very careful about what you're doing, okay? The use of force should always be a last resort. That is self-explanatory. We want to do everything we can to be aware of the situation first and avoid the use of force. Defense is always last. And the second most important thing I think here is to understand the role of the protector. You're a protector. We're not police officers. We're not first responders. We're there to provide physical protection. The role of protector is to prevent the attack. Now, some things that you guys are probably, and ladies, have seen in the last week or so, especially if you're on a church security team, an attack doesn't have to mean a physical attack. It could mean a physical attack. But an attack could be like a strong criticism, like a protest. That could put the facility at risk based on the situation, and so a protest could be a strong or a form of criticism, and we could consider that as an attack. Not an attack where we physically have to respond, but we're going to have to deal with or respond to the situation, again, not physically, but we may have to deal with that to try to get that off the property. We might try to lessen our risk socially and politically. So a protest, and again, some of you folks have might have observed some of this over the past week, and we're going to talk about it in a few minutes. A protest can be an attack because, again, we have to be very careful about what is done and what is said. All right, so let's talk about what is force. So last two seminars, we talked about the use of deadly force. We're going to get away from that and just talk about force in general. So force, by definition, is power or constraint exerted upon a person or against a person. Now, there are two general categories of force. We've talked about one in detail. So deadly force, which is any force likely to or intended to cause death, serious bodily injury, or bodily harm. It's usually justified only under the most extreme conditions, when all lesser means have failed and cannot be reasonably employed. So that is our last resort. All right. So deadly force is one category that we've talked about again in detail. Then we've got non-deadly force. We're going to really address non-deadly force today. And non-deadly force is obviously going to be the opposite of deadly force, and that is force that is not likely to or intended to cause any kind of death or serious bodily injury. All right, so we're going to focus specifically today on that non-deadly force. More than likely, as a private citizen, if you do have to use force, it's not going to be with a handgun. More than likely, it's going to be with empty hand control or something else, all right, because it's not going to be a deadly force situation, more than likely. All right. So let's talk about as a citizen, and again, this gets into private security personnel. This gets into volunteer security teams also for churches, ministries, houses of worship. A person may protect themselves from harm under the appropriate circumstances. Every state in the United States covers this in their statutes or law. So as a private citizen, you do have a right to protect yourself under appropriate circumstances. And the appropriate circumstances means that you're innocent. We talked about this last week, that you're righteous and you're following that code of that statute. All right? But again, you need to research your local laws regarding the use of force by a private citizen. Here in just a second, I'm going to show you an example here in the state of Tennessee, what the state of Tennessee says about the use of force for a private citizen. Now, the title is a little confusing because it's not necessarily just talking about deadly force, it's talking about the use of force, but I want to get into it. You do the same thing. Look at the statute in your state so you can understand fully what it means for you to use force. So here in the state of Tennessee, so we're going to talk about some general terms here to help you kind of walk through this process. Tennessee Code Annotated, or what we call TCA, in short, or the abbreviation, are the state laws for Tennessee. All right. So under 3911-621, the use of deadly force by a private citizen actually gets into when a private citizen or how a private citizen can use force in a certain situation. Here's what it says: a private citizen making an arrest, and I'll get into that in just a second, authorized by law, may use force, remember these words, they're highlighted here, that are reasonably necessary to accomplish the arrest of an individual who flees or resists the arrest, provided, this is even more important for later on, that a private citizen cannot use or threaten to use deadly force. Not force, but deadly force. Remember, we talked about those two categories, non-deadly force and deadly force. Cannot use or threaten to use deadly force except to the extent authorized under self-defense or defense of a third person statutes. And in Tennessee, that's 3911-611, which is self-defense, and 3911-612, defense of others. And those are the two circumstances in the state of Tennessee when you can use deadly force. So, pretty much like every other state, there's a statute that says, is probably very similar language in your state, I'm assuming, that talks about, hey, as a private citizen, to defend yourself or to make a physical arrest, you can use the amount of force necessary to effect that arrest, but it must be reasonable. So let's talk about what that means in arrest. Arrest doesn't mean, look, I put on a badge as a private citizen, I've got a pair of handcuffs, I go snatch somebody up, I handcuff them and read them their rights. Hey, sir, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you can, or anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. It's not necessarily that when we talk about a private citizen. An arrest just means I'm stopping somebody. They are no longer free to go. Okay? An arrest could also mean you tackle somebody because you see something and they're violating the law and you're trying to stop that. That, by definition, under the law is an arrest. So it's to be detained. The physical act of touching or putting your hands on someone, like very specifically the person that you're trying to detain, is also an arrest. When someone is not free to go, it is an arrest because they can't leave. The circumstances in general in the United States, in general, now again, some of these vary by law, but we can stop someone or arrest someone as a private citizen when we either observe a crime that has been committed, like a misdemeanor, or we observe a more serious crime like a felony, or we have reasonable cause to believe that a felony has been committed. Now, let's talk about misdemeanors and felonies just real quick. A misdemeanor crime could be something as easy or as simple as trespassing. So what this says is I'm able to stop and detain someone, possibly arrest them, possibly detain them and call the police, and as a private citizen charge them with something because they've broken the law. And something like a misdemeanor, again, could be something as simple as someone comes on your property and it's private property. You don't want them there, or the property of someplace you're trying to protect. You ask them to leave and they refuse. That's a crime. It's also a crime if someone comes on your property and they destroy that property, they vandalize that property, or the property that belongs to someone else that you're charged with protecting. Those can be misdemeanors. Now, if the damage gets to be monetarily at a high level, if people get injured or there's a potential for people to be injured, then that turns into a felony. In Tennessee in general, a misdemeanor crime is something that's punishable up to 11 months or 29 days, or actually less than. So what that means is a misdemeanor crime in general here means that if you were to get charged and convicted, you would not serve, your time or your sentencing would be less than a year. A felony, what that means is you can serve your charge, and then your conviction would be a year or more. Okay, so that's just general terms and the general definitions for misdemeanor and felony. So you can use force here in the state of Tennessee, and more than likely in your state it's the same, when we see someone doing something or we have reasonable cause to believe it's something more serious. When we try to stop them or detain them, we as a private citizen here can use the force necessary to effect that arrest. But remember, it has to be reasonable. And I'm going to get into that in just a second. What does that mean as a private citizen? As you can already tell, or you should be able to already tell or articulate or figure this out in your mind, this is very complicated for private citizens. It is why our model is always to be aware of our situation and mitigate any risk, try to avoid any undesirable events, and then we get into the defense part of the use of force part last always. Because, and we're going to get into this in just a few minutes, these things happen very, very quickly, and a lot of times under stress, the decisions we make are not always the best decisions, and it puts us and the organization that we may be trying to protect at risk. Okay? So let's talk about reasonable force. You might want to write this down. Okay? Reasonable force is the minimal amount of force. Let me say that again. As a private citizen, reasonable force is the minimal amount of force necessary to overcome an opposing force. Now, the key words there are minimal and necessary. Understand, for it to be minimal and necessary, my use of force does not have to be equal to that opposing force. And here's what that means. If somebody's got their hands around my neck, okay, especially if they're bigger than me, they're stronger, or if I'm in fear, that doesn't mean that I only have to use my hands and push that person away. All right? So it's not 50-50. To be reasonable and to be necessary doesn't mean it has to be equal. Okay? But again, you need to research your state laws to figure out what that means. So I don't want you to misunderstand that reasonable force is, okay, he puts his hands on me, now I can only put my hands back on him. That is not the case, and we're going to talk about or kind of give you some guidelines of what that means here as we go through the presentation. Okay? So when we talk about how we judge this, or what is our guideline or standard, there's something called a use of force continuum. Now, if you've had experience in law enforcement, your prior law enforcement, you've got family members in law enforcement, you took a criminal justice course in college, I don't know, you watch CSI or, whatever, you've probably heard of the use of force continuum. So most of the time, people think of the use of force continuum as a law enforcement function, and that is not true. So the use of force continuum, this applies to us also, is a guideline that we can use as a private citizen as a standard for the amount of force that we can use against a resistant person. Okay? So it is a guideline that we can use as a standard for the amount of force that we can use against a resistant person. Now, here's what I want you to understand. Resistant doesn't necessarily mean physically resistant. Again, it can mean that someone just doesn't want to leave your property. So like verbally, they could be resistant. They could be passively resistant. They could say, no, we're not going to leave. You got to call the police, or you can call the police and we're still not going to leave. We're going to stay on your property and we're going to do whatever we want. So they don't have to be physically resistant. So when we start to think about the use of force continuum, I want you to think about things like right away, de-escalation. So the use of force continuum helps us, or it can naturally de-escalate a situation based on the way that we've been trained and based on the way we deploy this continuum. So this works for private citizens, it works for private security officers, and it also works for volunteer security teams. So let me give you an example of a use of force continuum, what that means. Now, before we get into it, here's some things I want you to understand about a use of force continuum and about these situations, why you want to avoid them. Number one, if we get into a situation where we have to use force, let's talk about just the general category of non-deadly force. Situations occur very quickly. We're going to show you some videos here shortly and show you how things get spun up very, very quickly, and decisions get made under stress that sometimes are not the best. And today, the decisions that you make and the actions that you undertake could very well be put on social media and broadcast throughout the world very, very quickly. And so things happen very quickly, number one. Number two, sometimes escalation is unavoidable. Now, that doesn't mean I'm going to go from standing on my post to grabbing somebody or going to a pistol, but understand the use of force continuum is important because things happen quickly and sometimes escalation is unavoidable. No matter what you do, you might have to escalate to 1 or 2 levels above where you started. And a lot of times that's not something that you brought on, it's something that somebody else caused. So having this guideline or standard is very important. Use of force by private citizens. There is a perception today, especially in the court of public opinion, very specifically I'm talking about the media. If you've paid attention in the last couple of weeks, you've seen it, where as a private citizen, maybe it's bad for us to protect ourselves or our property. And that's absolutely ridiculous. We live in a republic. But it's another reason why understanding the use of force continuum and having a standard or a guideline is very important, so we can articulate and so we can be able to stand up against those who oppose us when we try to exert our rights, very specifically the rights that are given to us under the republic. Another reason why this continuum is important, and I'm not trying to give them a hard time. I was a police officer for almost 12 years. My stepfather who raised me was a police officer. I have a brother-in-law that's a retired police officer. I've got family members that are police officers throughout the country. So I'm not giving them a hard time, but I want you to understand, and this is from experience, when you get involved in a situation as a citizen, especially the use of force, someone calls the police at some point are going to show up. They don't always understand the law regarding use of force in private citizens. If you pay attention and you watch the news, there's a lot of videos out there where, and I don't agree with it, where people test the open carry, the idea of open carry and the laws in their state. There's a lot of states, or several states in the country, that allow you, if you have a carry permit, to be open carry. Some states don't have to have any permit and allow open carry. And there have been situations where people test that. And again, I don't agree with testing law enforcement. You shouldn't do that. But where they go out in public places, open carry, and the police are called. And the police, because they don't exactly understand those laws, because they don't deal with them all the time, there's a misunderstanding and there's conflict caused. So sometimes you use deadly force, you have to use just general force in a situation, the police are called and they show up. They may not understand exactly your rights as a citizen or what's allowed as a private citizen in a use of force situation. And because of that, if you know the law and you have a standard, it could assist you and it could help that responder also. And again, laws, when we talk about the use of force by a private citizen, vary in every state. So again, it's very important for you to understand you need some sort of a standard or guideline, and that is what the use of force continuum could be. So I'm going to give you very quickly my idea of what a use of force continuum would look like for a citizen. Now, again, we focus a lot on helping faith-based organizations. I mean, we're a private company. Michael Mann Security Services or Masada Consulting it really is who we are. is a private corporation or a very small private corporation, and obviously we charge for training services and for assessments. But we try to give away as much as we can to faith-based organizations to help them. And if you're part of a faith-based organization, a house of worship, or some other kind of ministry, as I start to talk about this, you're starting to think about how complicated this gets. And again, it's not all about the gun. This is a very, very serious subject that as a volunteer security ministry member, you really need to look into it. You need to study it, and you need to be thinking about these things really before you even implement a security team. And if you haven't, and you have a team in place and you don't have a standard, you need to start looking at that right away. We, very specifically ministries, right now are being challenged in ways that we've never been challenged before. In a lot of ways, there are opportunities, but in a lot of ways, there are also challenges. And because there's very few standards when we talk about volunteer security ministries, when you run into these situations, it could turn into an undesirable event very, very quickly. So I cannot stress, if you are a volunteer security ministry protecting houses of worship or other ministries, if you don't have a standard, if you don't have a training program, folks, you better jump on it now. And you're starting to see, you should start to understand, it's not about the gun, it's not about police officers, it's about physical protection and trying to avoid this risk, okay? I'll get off my soapbox and stop preaching because I'm not a preacher. So let's talk about the use of force continuum. Here's an example for you. Number one, now, if you're a former police officer, you know someone's a police officer, you've heard them talk about their use of force continuum, you're going to see that this is a little bit different and there's a reason for that. Number one, even though we're talking about escalation or de-escalation, number one, avoid conflict as much as possible. So as you step on post, or even as a private citizen out in the public and you're with your family, you're trying to protect them, or that's what you're thinking about doing as you're out in the public. I want to concentrate on avoiding getting into any situation where force is going to have to be used. So avoid any of this hazard or your exposure to a hazard, which is risk, as much as possible. Do everything you can to avoid it. That is why we talk about the Israeli security concept, a concept that we teach that I learned from the Israelis and from other folks. That's why we talk about post-standing procedures. It's why we talk about deterrence and gathering intelligence and information. All of that helps you avoid these situations, okay? So number one, when we talk about our use of force continuum, that very first piece or that very first level is going to be avoidance, the mindset of trying to avoid everything that's undesirable as possible. Number two would be my physical awareness of presence. Now, police officers, their idea of this is officer presence. Somebody shows up in a uniform and they've got a gun, they've got a baton on, pepper spray, tasers, they're driving a marked car. The idea is that uniform, the gun, that presence of force would stop someone from doing something to deter them. As a private citizen, we don't do that. As a private citizen, more than likely, if you're carrying a weapon, it's going to be concealed, or in my opinion, it probably should be. Very specifically, if you're doing this for faith-based organizations, and even if you're out in the public with your family, it's my opinion your weapon should be concealed. So when we talk about awareness of presence, we're not talking about an overwhelming show of force. What we're talking about is we are situationally aware of what's happening. We understand our threat. We understand the detectable elements in that threat process. And because we're watching and we're paying attention, we deter the potential of that threat ever occurring. Because we understand it, we understand the detectable elements in that process, and because of that, and while we're gathering that information, it psychologically impacts that adversary's motivation to actually conduct whatever that attack might be. So for us, that's our awareness of presence. If you're a single mom, or if you're a wife and you're out with your children and your husband is not with you, or you're just out alone by yourself, this applies to you. It's your awareness of your surroundings and paying attention to what's going on. And if you see something doesn't look right, then you automatically address that, and not by confronting it, but maybe avoiding it, getting away from it, paying attention to it, getting on the phone, calling somebody, whatever. This is what we talk about when we talk about awareness and presence. It's deterrence through observation and through gathering information. In the church security world, folks, this is why, literally, this is so important, is because this does not conflict with the mission of the church. This doesn't chase anybody off that wants to come in. The people that want to come in and hear the good word, this awareness and presence does not deter them from coming in the building. This potentially deters the adversary. Number 3, we see a problem, so we couldn't avoid it. Our physical presence doesn't stop it. Maybe the next thing we do as a private citizen or as a ministry is we call someone to help us. We pick up the phone and we call the police. If you're a ministry and you're lucky enough to have a police presence on Sunday or when there's worship, maybe it's just getting on a radio or sending a text to say, hey, could you come over here and deal with this situation for us? But that next level might be that you pick up and call somebody. Now, based on the situation, understand as we start to escalate or maybe even de-escalate through these levels, the situation may call for you to go from avoidance all the way to the use of deadly force very quickly. I'm just walking you through each step to show you what each step will look like. And the next slide, we're going to get into the levels and how or what we might think about when we start talking about escalation, some things that may escalate or cause us to escalate through these very quickly or skip levels. That next might be verbalization. So I'll call someone to come assist. At that point, while I'm waiting, the avoidance, the awareness didn't stop the person or persons, and at that point I'm going to verbalize. I'm going to tell them what it is I expect from them. Maybe that's stop, maybe that's, hey, can I help you with something? And when they tell you what they want, it's something that you don't allow on your property. Then at that point you give them the notice that's not allowed and you don't want them there anymore. Okay? So that next level is going to be verbalization. Okay? Again, it could be something stop, put down the weapon, but here we're talking about give them the expectation that it is that you want them to know or you want them to have. Tell them what it is that they're supposed to do based on the rules of the property. Then we get into things like physical control. Physical control could be something as simple as lightly touching someone on the arm. So it's what we used to call a come-along technique, or we're trying to guide somebody off the property. And it could get as serious as the use of intermediate weapons. And if you don't know what intermediate weapons are, those are tools that we use when deadly force is not authorized. But the use of empty hand control is not going to be sufficient to control the situation. So we talk about things like oleander resin capsicum, pepper spray. We talk about maybe even something like an expandable baton or a taser. Let me caution you about the use of intermediate weapons. Number one, if you're serving either as a private security officer, you're a private citizen, or you're serving on a volunteer security ministry, understand this. You need to know the laws in your state regarding the use of an intermediate weapon or the possession of an intermediate weapon as a private citizen. An example in the state of Tennessee. As a private citizen, you can carry OC spray or pepper spray on you at all times. You can have it with you. You can have it in your car. You don't have to have any training to do that. However, to carry an expandable baton, you do have to have training, very specifically from a certified instructor who's certified through the Tennessee Department of Commerce and Insurance. And that person, once you complete the training, must give you a card, and that card must be on your person at all times. If you don't go through that training and you don't have that card, and you've got an expandable baton in your person or in your car, then you're in or unlawful possession. The charge is unlawful possession of a weapon. Okay, so understand when we start to talk about intermediate weapons, you need to research the laws in your state. Tasers are the same way. In some states, a citizen can carry a taser. In some states, a citizen must go through training before they can do that. And a taser, again, is just another intermediate weapon. So physical control can be everything as simple as just very lightly touching someone by the arm to try to escort them out of the building or property, all the way up to the use of impact weapons, or even maybe hard empty hand control, like the use of Krav or some sort of martial arts. Something else I would caution you about, very specifically volunteer security ministries and private citizens protecting your families. If you are taking some sort of unarmed combatives or self-defense, whether that's traditional martial arts, it's Krav, if the use of force and the standards in your state are not taught at that school, you need to research that on your own and understand when you can use those techniques that you're being taught. Ignorance of the law is not a defense in court when you're being charged with assault or aggravated assault. Let me say that again. Ignorance of the law is not a defense when you've been charged with assault, aggravated assault, or something more serious. Okay? So if you're taking unarmed combatives or self-defense from an instructor somewhere that runs a school, their job is not to teach you about when you can use that. Basically, their job, because they're a private business, is to teach you those techniques. But you on your own, more than likely, are going to have to learn when you can use those techniques based on the laws in your state. And then, of course, that last element is going to be the use of deadly force. Okay? So that's a lot to think about as far as use of force continuum for a private citizen, and it looks a little bit different for us than it does for police because, number one, we're private citizens, and we don't have the immunities and privileges that police officers have. All right, so when can I escalate to go through these? So here's some things just to consider when we start to talk about escalation through those levels. You might go all the way from avoidance to the use of deadly force depending on the situation. So some things to think about. You've heard me talk about these things. We call these elements escalating factors in other training courses. Here we're just talking about when we can go through these or what's the appropriate level. So number one, a consideration might be age. At 52 years old, look, I still do unarmed combatives. We teach those. I still shoot a lot. I exercise 6 times a week, or I did. But at my age, about 2 weeks ago, I literally tore my hamstring ring. And so right now, I can't go run. Physically, I can't kick. If I try to kick a bag, it hurts my hamstring. It hurts my leg because my hamstring is healing from a tear, from a very serious tear. So right now, because of my age, there's a disability. You know, this wouldn't have happened to me when I was 35. And so if I have to get into a use of force situation now, my age is going to be a factor in how quickly I might escalate through my use of force continuum. Something else may be relative strength. Look, if I'm a 12-year-old child and I'm being choked by a 28-year-old adult, then the use of force or what technique or what I'm going to use on that continuum is going to be very, very different. Maybe if you're a smaller woman and a guy that's twice your weight and twice your size is on top of you and they're trying to beat you into an unconscious state, physical empty hand control is probably not going to work, potentially. And so you might have to escalate from literally the use of your hands up to deadly force, depending on the situation. Size, we talked about that already. If someone's, if they're bigger than you are, if they weigh more than you, that may allow you or cause you to escalate through that use of force continuum. Skill level, if the adversary, the opponent, is at a skill level that's above what you have or what you know, and you know that might give you the ability, or that might cause you to escalate through those levels quickly or skip from one level to maybe 3 levels up. All right. And then, of course, multiple individuals. We've seen these on videos here lately. We're going to see that again here in just a minute. There's more than one. Okay, there's more than one person. The law, generally in the United States of America, understands, look, if it's more than one person, that is an escalating factor. I'm going to have to go through those appropriate levels or maybe skip from one level, so number 1 up to number 3 or number 4, because there's more than one. I can't defend myself against more than one person. Okay, so that's something that we're not expected to do. All right, we're going to show a video here in just a minute. You saw this last week. This is just an example. I think this is the video of how we talked about some things to consider in the very beginning, and that is these situations occur very, very quickly. This situation occurred very, very quickly. So this is what happened. We talked about this last week. This happened in Albuquerque, New Mexico. So there was a group of they weren't protesters because actually they were trying to destroy property, so it was civil unrest. So they were breaking the law or attempting to break the law. So they're trying to tear down a statue that belongs to the state. There was a group that showed up because they heard that it was going to happen that opposed that. And so the gentleman that you're going to see in this video, there was some sort of altercation or something before. I think it was verbal. He actually, when you watch this, based on what you see, he very quickly goes through use of force continuum. So what he does, because a confrontation, physical confrontation starts, he tries to avoid it. He tries to run away. He tries to get away. They very quickly follow him. In fact, you're going to hear it's like a mob. They start screaming to go after him. At some point, they start to chase him. He runs away. They start to physically assault him. He tries to physically open hand control, fight back. But when it gets to be more than 2 and 3 people and they start to use blunt objects, he has to very quickly escalate to another level of force in the force continuum, and it turns out to be deadly force. After this incident, immediately he is arrested and charged with some very specific crimes, and very quickly the state jumped in after they looked at the video told the city of Albuquerque, no, you need to put those charges on hold. We're going to look at this. There's some things we have not looked at, and the charges were eventually dismissed because what I think they determined was that this was justifiable. So you're going to see how quickly this happens. This is how fast this happens. This is not going to take 5 minutes, 10 minutes. It can take a matter of seconds. Okay.
Kill you!
So you can see very quickly that escalated, and you watched, you saw when it turned into started to turn into a serious confrontation. He's trying to walk away from these folks that are causing the civil unrest. And then they start to chase him. He even puts his hand out. Like, not only was he telling them to stay away, but there was these nonverbals to try to let them know, hey, I don't want any part of this. I don't want any trouble. Just leave me alone. I don't agree with what you're doing, but I don't want to fight. And that turned into the mob rushing on him, then taking blunt objects. In fact, if you could hear it, they started screaming that they were going to kill him. And then as they started to hit him, he very, very quickly started to lose control. Empty hand control was not going to be sufficient, and he had to very quickly escalate into the use of deadly force. It's my understanding this is justified. So you can see how very quickly this starts to escalate, and why we want to try to use that deterrence and intelligence and go through the process of staying away or avoiding situations like this. Now, something that's come up we're going to get into because I promised we would talk about it. And again, I want to keep this about 30 to 40 minutes, so we're getting close to time. Display of a firearm. Understand in every state there's really not good guidelines on the display of a firearm. When I start to research, hey, when can you draw a pistol and when you can't, it's not really clear in any state. So I'm going to give you just some guidelines on what that means. Number one, the display of a firearm during some sort of a situation. So you're working through your use of force continuum and you believe that it may be necessary at some point to use deadly force. And before that happens, you draw your firearm. Okay? So understand that state laws vary on the way that they describe the drawing of a firearm by a private citizen. Some states call it, there's charges like brandishing, where you pull out a weapon, you brandish it. And if you're brandishing a weapon, you could be charged with like aggravated assault. Some states, I think here in the state of Tennessee, it's called the defensive display of a firearm. So understand that there's not a really good guideline in states. What you're going to have to do very quickly as you're working through this use of force continuum is you're going to have to take a snapshot threat assessment. Now, let me tell you where I got that term. Joe Artura and his wife Debbie run something called the Vehicle Dynamics Institute. It's headquartered up in New Jersey. I think the track now is in Pennsylvania. He's an executive protection professional, been in the business for a long time. I've been a student of Joe's for a long time. He's a great guy. He's got a wonderful wife. Debbie kind of runs the administrative part. He teaches what he calls a snapshot risk assessment in the solo practitioner course. So it's a course I've been through and some of the other courses where as a protector by yourself while you're protecting a person, how to take a what he calls a snapshot risk assessment. Here it's a snapshot threat assessment. So before I draw that firearm, you're going to have to determine if it's a threat. And here, threat is based on intent or capability, or by definition, a threat is going to be the intent or capability of the adversary to cause death or serious bodily injury to you or someone else that you're trying to protect or that you feel like you need to protect. So when we talk about intent, I can't read the mind of the adversary. So intent, and this is going to happen quickly, or it's going to have to happen quickly, in that snapshot threat assessment, you're going to have to look at the behavior of the actions and the words that are coming out of the person's mouth. So what are they doing? You know, it's like a threat assessment in the Israeli security concept, or field threat assessment. Number one, what are they doing? What are their actions? What are they doing? Are they drawing a pistol? They have blunt objects, and are their hands in their pocket? And what are they saying? If they're saying, I'm going to kill you, what does that mean? Well, if I can, based on the intent and the capability, or what I'm interpreting, or the intent, then maybe I can draw the pistol. And then when we get into capability, that's the actual means. So the intent, what it is they're thinking, what are their thoughts, what do they mean, what do they mean to do, right? So what are they saying, what are they doing? And that capability means that actual ability or the means for what it is that they're saying, or what it looks like they're wanting to do, that intent, it's going to give them that ability to do it. So when we talk about capability, what do they mean? Do they have a weapon? Is there more than one? Is it a blunt object? Is it a firearm? So very quickly you're going to have to take that information in and determine whether or not you can draw a pistol. And before we draw that pistol, we want to think about, is there some sort of an alternative before I have to draw the handgun? Can I run away? Can I lock myself in, behind a door? Can I get inside of a vehicle? Can I use that as a barrier? Another alternative to think about, and again, you're going to have to research your state laws and understand, I didn't find a state where it was really very, very clear. It's all about clear as mud. But also think about, instead of drawing the pistol and pointing, if you have it determined for sure it's a deadly force threat at that moment, it's not imminent yet, but you believe the firearm must come out, then there's something called low ready. And low ready is a defensive posture where you draw the pistol, the muzzle's depressed, it's not pointing anybody, where you can see the threat of the threat area in front of you. If there's an external safety system on the pistol, it is engaged, so the safety's on, and your trigger finger is straight along the frame of the pistol. I'm not saying that if you draw in low ready and the police come out or there's a video that you won't be charged with aggravated assault, but it is another alternative to pointing a pistol at someone, or it could be. All right? But you need to research the laws in your state. And again, it's always about that snapshot threat assessment, which has to determine intent and capability, or what we believe to be intent and capability like that. And number two, always, is there an alternative to this? So what you're going to see here in just a second is this happened. I don't remember the state. Sorry. There's a couple that's going into some sort of a restaurant. It's one of the fast food, Chipotle. I think it was Chipotle. Goes in, and there's some kind of confrontation between them. There's a mother, there's like a 15-year-old girl, and then there's this couple. Somewhere, some sort of verbal confrontation started where they're yelling at each other. And so this couple feels like there's a threat, there's a problem. The mother, so apparently the 15-year-old daughter, or according to what the mother is saying in the video, this couple has physically put their hands on the daughter or assaulted the daughter. The couple's trying to get in the car to get away to avoid the situation, it looks like, and the mother at some point bangs on the car to try to get them to stop, and I think she's telling somebody to call the police. At some point, the woman that was in the car, the couple, gets out, draws a firearm, and if I remember correctly, they point the firearm at this mother and daughter. Now, if you look at the video, when you look at this, if you're looking at the snapshot threat assessment, it doesn't appear that death or serious bodily injury were going to be a potential in this case. Now, I don't know, I was not here, but wherever the jurisdiction is, the jurisdiction, the police department there, they have charged them with some sort of a felony, like aggravated assault. It's something very similar, but they call it something else. So in a case where I just want you to see, I'm not saying this is right or wrong, I'm saying I want you to see very quickly how fast this escalates and what it is you need to think about before you actually draw that pistol or display that firearm, and what the ramifications of that might be. Okay?
She's a child.
She bumped into me when
so if she did something wrong, she needs to apologize. If she did
this ignorant woman bumped into a 15-year-old.
Right? Correct.
And you're on camera.
Okay.
You're feeling threatened.
Okay, well go in.
No, Mom.
I got this.
You're blocking me from getting in my car.
No, we weren't. No, we weren't. No, we weren't. You're ignorant.
Go ahead. Call them. No, we will. But you're not going to sit there and violate a 15-year-old.
She's ignorant.
Do it, bitch. Do it. Go ahead. Do it. I want you to do something.
She's very ignorant.
Dumbass bitch. Yeah, I said it. You say something, I'll beat your white ass too.
Oh, really?
Oh, I will. Do something. Please put your motherfucking hands up.
Do something.
Please.
Who the fuck do you think you guys are?
Who do you think you are?
Your wife think you are.
You calling her name? She did nothing to you.
Yeah,
I didn't. I didn't. No, you didn't. You're very racist and ignorant.
You're racist because you're calling
No,
her
you
name.
bumped it. She bumped into me.
You cannot just walk around calling white people racist. This is not that
Why
type
would
of
you
world.
bump her?
White people
Why
are
would you
racist.
bump her?
No one's
Why
racist.
would you bump her?
I
Why
care
did you
about
say
you.
sir
to make you feel like that.
Say sorry?
No one is racist.
If you didn't do
I'm
anything, why
sorry
did
if
you
you
do that?
had something like that happen.
Ignorance. Very. Ma, watch.
Get the fuck away from me!
You gonna get on her face.
You better get on my fucking
Right now, get away.
Get the fuck away! Get the fuck
Get away. Get the fuck away.
Are you gonna hit? You gonna shoot me?
Get the fuck away.
Oh!
Get away. Call the cops right now. Call them.
Oh!
Call the cops.
Get the fuck away.
Call the cops.
Get away.
She got the gun on me.
Call
He
them
hit me
now.
with the car. Call them. I'm telling. Get the
Call the cops.
Get the license.
So, obviously, a situation where I don't know what that snapshot threat assessment process looked like, but where there's a verbal confrontation. I think the mother of the daughter, struck the back of this couple's car. They get out, and then they go, when they look at the use of force continuum, they go directly, not into low ready, but they actually physically point the pistol at the mother, and then they were charged. Now, I don't know if they're going to be convicted of the crime. Who knows? We'll see. I'm sure it's going to be in social media on the news. We'll see what the outcome is here in a couple weeks or a couple months, depending on it. And maybe by the time this is resolved, it's going to be out of the news cycle. Maybe we'll know, maybe we won't. But I'm going to follow it to see what happens. So, again, don't think there was probably a deadly force threat here, but you need to make that snapshot threat assessment. If you haven't, again, figured this out, what this means, volunteer security teams and private citizens, you need to receive training very specific to physical protection. Let me say that again. You need to go out and get training that's specific to physical protection. Not about use of force for a police officer, not what a police officer would do, but what a private citizen would do, and what you have to do and what you have to do to follow the law and not get yourselves in trouble or arrested or charged with a crime, where you're going to have to pay an attorney to come in and represent you, and possibly, we talk about risk, face social and political risk because of something silly. And again, don't know what happened before this, don't know what's going to happen after it, just an example of what that snapshot threat assessment looks like, and what brandishing a firearm or a defensive display, what that means, when you should do it, just some things to think about. This is a case where happened in St. Louis a couple weeks ago. Sounds like there's a very kind of a left-wing district attorney. This is in St. Louis, and she's looking. I don't know if she's going to be able to charge them anything. The case here is criminals, and they broke into a gated area, and they actually broke into these people's property. So they had like a gate around their property, and they tore the gate down, got in, and they were protesting something. I don't think these people have done anything to anybody, but they were there on their property for whatever reason. So they broke the law. These people saw them break the law. At some point, they're in fear. So they come out, and they've got weapons in their hand. Now, they're on their property, and if I'm not mistaken, so I had security for a facility in Missouri for several years. Missouri's laws are very similar to Tennessee. So on your property, there's not, I think in this case, coming out with a firearm is probably not the problem. The problem here, number one, is the court of public opinion, and number two is weapons handling. So the issue here is, and they haven't been charged with anything. The district attorney's looking to see if she can charge them. But both of these folks, I think, from my understanding, are attorneys. Right away, they got an attorney, and their private attorney right away started conflict with the district attorney. So I think, this side is daring the county of St. Louis, the city, to even attempt to bring charges, and because of the situation that occurred. So here, I just want you to see, it's not the idea that there were weapons. I think it was the weapons handling, and of course where the muzzles were going. Now, again, people were on their property, they were protesting, there had been vandalism, but you have to make that snapshot threat assessment very quickly. Are you under the threat of death or serious bodily injury, and make that determination before a weapon is pointed. So here I think the only problem is, more than likely legally, is it's going to be poor weapons handling, and because muzzles were pointed very specifically at people. Again, we don't know what's going to happen, don't know what happened before, don't know what happened after, but just so you can see this here. So we're going over. Sorry, I apologize. It took this one took longer than what we expected. So just a couple things as a private citizen. Number one, research the laws in your state. Number two, you do need to understand what a force continuum looks like. I gave you an example of one. Maybe it works for you, maybe it doesn't. I'm not sure if it works in the state or jurisdiction you're in, but it's a good example of something at least to start to think about and research to keep yourself out of trouble. If you are a volunteer church security ministry, please, if you do not have a standard for the use of force, if you've got folks that are carrying weapons, they have not been trained in de-escalation, and they don't understand state law, I would encourage you to look into that right away and go find someone that's very well versed in security, number one, physical protection and security, and someone that understands the laws in your state regarding use of force, and get that training as soon as you can, okay? Again, look, we've got Church Protection Special Certification Module 1 coming up this Sunday. We cover this. We cover how to plan this in Module 1. Security Operations covers this, among other things like equipment, deterrence, post-standing procedures, techniques of observation. We cover everything that's 4 hours. You can wear your mask. You can wear your jammies. You can drink a milkshake while you're watching because it's all from the comfort of your own home. Do we have any questions? Yes, we do. All right. What do we got, Scott?
We have a couple, Michael. The first one is from Gary in Michigan. He says, protesters seem to be in a mode of provocation, whereas they are attempting to make us as church security take action against them. What's their goal? Do they want to institute legal action if we lay hands on them, or are they simply looking to disrupt our lives?
Yep. So I think it's two things, Gary. I think you're absolutely right. I think it's both. So number one, I think they are trying to disrupt what's happening. And so listen, all of this, and if you're not a believer and you're watching this, you're not a part of church security ministry, what I'm going to say, maybe you don't understand, maybe you don't agree with, but understand we live in a sinful, fallen world. And what is happening right now with all this civil disruption, it's just sin. It's all orchestrated by Satan, and it's all done because of us, because we're fallen, we're broken, we're sinful, and it's just our nature. And so, yes, Gary, number one, they're trying to disrupt the church because order in this world is the cross. It is the Word of God. The Word of God and the cross, which has always been very offensive, stands in the way of some objectives. And so even without the protesters or these civil disruptors knowing what they're doing, because they probably don't, for the most part, understand, they are just trying to disrupt the service. Because for whatever reason, I think they've been told something that's not true. And so it's unfortunate. But as Christians, our history has been based on disruption, and it's been based on a hatred for the cross because it is very offensive. So, number one, they are trying to disrupt. Number two, I think there are probably very specific groups that are out there, so no different than any terrorist organization. Understand a terrorist organization. I'm not saying the protesters are terrorists, but understand some of the tactics around this are to instigate something to where potentially an opposing group, maybe a security team, maybe a group of police officers, it could be just whoever they don't like, they are instigated into a point to where they have to use physical force that is caught on camera or caught on social media, and it will further their cause. It's very similar to, and again, this is based on your belief system. You don't like what I'm going to tell you, you can always cut this off. Look, I worked in Israel off and on for 2 years, and I studied in Israel. Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. It is the only hope for the Middle East. It's the only place in the Middle East where you have freedoms very similar to where we have here. It's a wonderful place. There are people who don't agree with that, but it's no different than the enemies that the Israelis face. There is a strong presence of untruth and disruption in Israel where something happens and the media very, very quickly blames the Israelis, and it's a media tactic and a tactic for the opposing organization to get sympathy. And so I think that's what's happening here. I think there are going to be certain groups that are going to not only come to church security teams, but a number of other private citizens and other private groups where they're going to try to instigate something where there is a use of force incident to further some sort of a cause or agenda. So just be careful. So yeah, I think it's both. Number one, they want to disrupt because the cross is offensive. And number two, I think there are going to be some groups that are trying to instigate this. So we need to be very careful. Hope I answered your question, Gary. Next question.
Next question is from longtime listener, first-time caller, Ramaya, who is 6,484 miles away in Azerbaijan. She wants to know, are foreign nationals entitled to the same rights as citizens in the U.S. when we talk about self-defense?
Yes, they are. So here, even as a foreign national, when we talk about self-defense, you have the right, while you're in this country, to protect yourself. Absolutely.
And then our good friend Trent over there in Camp Lejeune.
Yes, Trent. So yeah, well, Trent is one of our well, he's been watching us for a long time, and Trent's awesome, and his team's awesome.
So he says, we try to work in teams of 2, but I'm often by myself as the head of security. I've approached people at night by myself, taking all precautions. Is this safe, and what else can I do in order to deal with situations immediately?
Yeah, so we have to use the resources we have available. So some things you can do, Trent, and you guys learned this in part 1, and you guys are about to go through part 2 of our Israeli security concept. So you have to use the resources you have, and sometimes you're going to have to be by yourself. We do the same thing at Fellowship. There's sometimes at nighttime on post we stand by ourselves. So yes, can it be unsafe? I don't know the area exactly that you're in. Don't know the crime rate, but here's some things to probably lower your risk. Number 1, communication. So even if you don't have another security team member there, if you've got another ministry that's working, try to maintain communication with somebody else. So have radio communication, or you can use some of the apps that we talked about in some of our other training. So at least have communication with someone else. I think number 2, probably have the police on speed dial, or notify the police if you're going to be by yourself at nighttime. Let them know you're going to be there and ask for extra patrols. Number 3, and we cover all this in our Church Protection Specialist certification. Something else, Trent, you can think of, and if you don't have it, you let me know, and we're going to send you one for free. Illumination tools. So always, part of your support equipment, if you guys are armed, always, if you got a pistol, you should always have a flashlight. And Trent, if you don't have a decent flashlight, you let us know. You can let Scott know now, and we're going to send you a Surefire flashlight for free. So use of illumination tools, communication with someone at all times, even if it's not somebody on the security ministry. A notification if you're going to be by yourself to the local police that you're going to be by yourself. Ask for extra patrols, and of course, be prudent. And understand what those snapshot threat assessments look like. So I hope I answered your question, Trent. And seriously, if you don't have a decent illumination tool, you let us know. We're going to send you one for free. All right, no more questions. Folks, we went well over an hour. Thanks for the questions. Thanks for tuning in. Remember, next week we're going to do Tuesday. It's going to be terrorism. Whoops, I almost dropped my glasses. Don't want to do that. I'm old and I can't read without them. So do you see how... But fast reflexes. You see how fast that was? Like a 25-year-old, like a cat. It's like a cheetah. All right? So, inside joke. All right? So, anyway, next Tuesday, terrorism for the security professional. It doesn't matter who you are. You don't have to be a paid security person. Tune in next week. We're going to have people there at Lighthouse Christian School with us. They're going to be watching the presentation live right there in the auditorium with us. Tune in. It's going to be on Facebook Live. We're going to send that out again to let everybody know again. You just come to Safe with Mann on our Facebook page at 5:30. Is it 5:30? 5:30 p.m. to 7:30 p.m. Central Standard Time. We're going to be there. Just come and join us. It's 2 hours, so it's longer. We're going to go into a deep dive in terrorism and what that looks like. Domestic terrorist organizations, international terrorist organizations, and some of the tactics right now that we're seeing in the United States, how you can identify those tactics and what to do about them. As always, folks, thank you again. Thanks for watching us and giving us your time on Wednesdays. Again, we're going to do this on Tuesday next week. And remember, folks, as always, it's about prevention, not response.